I'll start right now. We already have 118 people, okay? Hola, buenos días. Bienvenidos todos nuestros socios y aliados al webinar del día de hoy, evento organizado por Desarrollo Económico de Ciudad Juárez y Desarrollo Económico de Chihuahua. Este webinar es la continuación de los eventos que hemos tenido en días pasados y más allá de escuchar valiosas opiniones de líderes, también estamos cumpliendo con una gran labor social, ya que los recursos que generosamente nos han apoyado socios y donantes pues están siendo destinados para el proyecto Héroes de la Salud. Muchas gracias a todos por su apoyo. El día de hoy, como lo hemos mencionado, tenemos invitado de lujo a Beto O Rourke. Adicionalmente nos están acompañando como moderadores Álvaro Bustillos y Miguel Guerrero, presidentes respectivamente de Desarrollo Económico de Juárez y de Chihuahua, así como coinvitado también de honor Enrique Perret, director de la US Mexico Foundation. Sin mayor preámbulo, le cedo la palabra a Álvaro para comenzar con nuestro webinar y nuevamente muy agradecidos por contar con su presencia y con su apoyo. Adelante, Álvaro.
Gracias. Bueno, pues muy buenos días a todos. Voy a dar una introducción en español. Al cabo es que Beto es un aliado mexicano y sabe muy bien español. Quiero poner un poquito en perspectiva lo que es Ciudad Juárez y Chihuahua. Le quiero dar la bienvenida especialmente a los socios de Desarrollo Económico y a todos nuestros amigos y aliados. Como ustedes saben, Chihuahua es uno de la cuarta zona manufacturera más importante del mundo. Tenemos una región aquí increíble en términos de tecnologías avanzadas, fuerza laboral, etcétera. Tenemos representación de 70 empresas del Fortune 500 y como ustedes saben, hemos dirigido una serie de campañas para coordinarnos con organismos empresariales y aliados estratégicos para poner a nuestra región en el mapa. Quiero agradecer aquí a todos los amigos que están escuchándonos el día de hoy. Bienvenidos y les cedo la palabra aquí a Miguel Guerrero para que les dé la bienvenida a los amigos de Chihuahua. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Álvaro. Muchas gracias a todos quienes están presentes en esta conferencia. Beto, es un privilegio volver a verte de nuevo. Queremos tomar estos minutos para agradecer tu tiempo, agradecer todos los esfuerzos que tú estás haciendo por nuestra comunidad. Desde luego que hace 47 años que han pasado ya desde que esta organización se fundó. Estamos completamente convencidos de que necesitamos mantener nuestras instituciones fuertes, pero nuestras alianzas todavía más fuertes. Este es el momento en el que tenemos que empezar a generar ciertos cambios en la manera de proceder, en la manera de hacer negocios, en la manera de hacer nuestras alianzas y nuestras convergencias en conjunto. Porque, pues, sin duda alguna, esta pandemia vino a sacudir todas las anteriores prácticas y es momento de empezar a emprender con innovación, con negocios disruptivos, con maneras distintas de generar iniciativas en beneficio de nuestra comunidad, brindando una mejor calidad de vida para cada uno de los ciudadanos que habitan nuestras regiones. Hoy más que nunca toma un papel importante la alianza que podamos hacer con Estados Unidos, porque al final del día tenemos mucha compatibilidad Gran parte de la industria depende de ambas regiones. La cadena de valor como tal nos permite crecer como industria mexicana, nos permite tener una mayor participación de socios extranjeros y de también capitales mexicanos para participar en todos aquellos frentes que permitan que se generen las condiciones para el desarrollo económico. Es así, Beto, como yo te doy la más cordial de las bienvenidas. Muchas gracias por tu tiempo, por el esfuerzo, por todo lo que imprimes para la comunidad mexicana, que sé que es mucho. Y también quiero agradecer a todos nuestros socios de desarrollo económico, todas estas alianzas que hemos venido haciendo entre Chihuahua, Juárez, Cuauhtémoc y todas las distintas regiones del estado. Y como yo quisiera agradecer a todos quienes han aportado generosamente de su capital para poder llevar a cabo estas sesiones, pero también para apoyar los distintos programas que en el estado y en el municipio se han venido dando para beneficio de todas aquellas personas que están al frente del sector salud. Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a Enrique Perret. Gracias, Beto, de nuevo. Gracias a todos nuestros socios y gracias a todos nuestros invitados especiales que hoy se encuentran escuchando esta conferencia. Estamos a sus órdenes desde Desarrollo Económico de Chihuahua y Juárez para atender cualquier circunstancia, cualquier duda y apoyar en todo lo necesario. Saludos.
Thank you, Miguel. Hey, Beto. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I think I'm the only one outside the region, but I'm also a border guy. I'm from Piedras Negras, Coahuila, with Eagle Pass, Texas, in the border. I'm now in Washington, D.C. I lead the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, Beto, and I mean, our goal is basically what you have been doing for many years, right? The topics are immigration, the vulnerability right now on the Hispanic community in the U.S. because the COVID and because the economics, the supply chain, obviously to engage more people in the U.S. and in Mexico on the relationship. So that's our goal. That's what we're doing here in Washington and back in Mexico City. Happy to have you here, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you again.
I'm just gonna read Beto's bio pretty quick for everybody, and then we'll start. I'll turn it over to Beto. Thank you. Beto O Rourke was born in 1972 and grew up in El Paso, Texas. He earned a bachelor's degree in English from Columbia University in 1995. O'Rourke returned to El Paso in 1998 and co-founded the IT consulting company Stanton Street. In 2005, Beto was elected to the El Paso City Council, where he served until 2011. He ran to represent Texas' 16th congressional district in the U.S. House in 2012, defeating 8-term incumbent Sylvester Reyes in the Democratic Party with 51% of the vote and winning the general election with 65%. He served in the U.S. House until 2019. Beto challenged Senator Ted Cruz in the U.S. Senate election for Texas in 2018 and raised more than $80 million for his bid, the most that has ever been raised by a U.S. Senate candidate at a time. On March 14, 2019, Beto announced that he was running for president of the United States. Beto announced he was ending his campaign on November 1, 2019. Thank you, Beto, and I move it to you.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone who's on here. Muy buenos días y gracias por la oportunidad de estar con ustedes y platicar un poco sobre las relaciones entre los Estados Unidos y México, entre Chihuahua y Texas, entre Ciudad Juárez y El Paso. Es un placer y un honor. And with your permission, I'll now continue my remarks in English, but I want to thank Fernando and Enrique and Miguel and Alvaro, especially you. Part of the reason that we're talking today is because I reached out to you about 3 or 4 weeks ago with an urgent need here in El Paso. Our food bank, which is seeing unprecedented demand. There are lines that stretch 2 or 3 miles long with people waiting to pick up a week's worth of groceries here in El Paso to feed themselves and their families demand that has increased more than 400% since before COVID-19. And at a time where there are twice as many people in Texas who have filed for unemployment in the last 2 months as did in all of 2019. A lot of pain and a lot of hurt here, as I know there is in Ciudad Juarez and in Chihuahua and throughout the United States and throughout Mexico. But our food bank literally could not find enough food to be able to distribute to the people of El Paso. And so I called you and asked you to leverage your contacts and your connections throughout Chihuahua and Mexico to see if we could help the food bank here in El Paso. And you were so responsive and so helpful. And it made me so proud of the US-Mexico relationship. I thought in your responsiveness and the way that you stepped up to meet this need here in El Paso, it describes beautifully the power of our relationship and the potential that we have if we will only take advantage of it. So I want to thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who's working so hard right now to take care of one another at this time of unprecedented need and unprecedented danger. This is obviously the greatest pandemic the world has ever faced, at least in the last 100 years. More than 100,000 people in the United States have died by the official count. I think the unofficial count is probably much higher because we have failed to test everyone who needs to be tested. In Mexico, I believe the official count is over 8,600 people have died. Again, unofficially, I think we all assume that that number is much higher for lack of testing and accurate reporting right now in Mexico. But the bottom line is that we are in the midst of a very dangerous pandemic, and it is incumbent upon all of us to do all that we can to keep each other safe. And that might mean staying at home if we can, covering our faces with a mask when we have to go out. And then, as Alvaro did for the hungry here in El Paso, stepping up when we have the resources to help and provide for one another. When Alvaro asked me to talk about the nature of the US-Mexico relationship and offer you some thoughts, you know, I had to begin with some humility and acknowledge that those on this call know just as much about the US-Mexico relationship as I do, if not more. You live it day in and day out. It's fundamental to your business or your civic life or your family or your history or just who you are as a person. And so I thought I'd just begin in a very personal way and tell you that in my life, I feel as though I've been defined by the US-Mexico border, by El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And in some ways, my life has been circumscribed by this border. And I'll give you some examples. Alvaro mentioned that I was born here in El Paso in 1972. My dad was born here in El Paso in 1942. His dad was born here in El Paso before him, and his dad's dad chose to come here. His parents were immigrants from Ireland. He worked on the railroad first in Nebraska, then in Tucumcari, New Mexico, then here in El Paso, Texas, where he wanted to be, where he planted his flag, raised his family, and every succeeding generation of O'Rourke's was born. And I find that to be true for so many of the families in this region. For example, my wife, Amy, both of her grandfathers were born in Chihuahua, you know, by choice from their parents, because that was the land of opportunity, whether it was El Paso or Ciudad Juarez or Parral or Chihuahua City. That was where the action and the opportunity and the innovation and the ingenuity existed. And it drew talent, and it drew genius, and it drew people who wanted to make their mark on the world. This room that I'm in right now, my living room here in Sunset Heights, El Paso, hosted Pancho Villa and General Hugh Scott, the Chief of Staff from the United States Army, 105 years ago in August of 1915. They held a conference here in this living room, you know, perhaps sitting exactly where I'm sitting right now, to try to resolve some differences between the United States and the army that General Villa led. And the issues at the time were confiscation of American property and mining interests in the state of Chihuahua, but they were also trying to figure out how to keep the peace between the two countries. And I would say that the results were uneven. Although Pancho Villa desisted in his appropriation of American mining and agricultural interests in Chihuahua, he would, within the next 6 months, invade the United States at Columbus, New Mexico. So even this house is part of the story and history of the United States and Mexico and our relations together. This neighborhood that I live in, Sunset Heights, became the refuge for Porfirio Diaz's partisans. The expatriates from the revolution migrated here to Sunset Heights and built many of the homes in this neighborhood here in El Paso. In fact, about 2 blocks from here is Porfirio Diaz Street. Not many streets in the world named after that former dictator, but there's one right here in El Paso, Texas. As a businessman, you know, I named my company Stanton Street because Stanton Street's an important street here in El Paso, but as we all know, it turns into an important street in Ciudad Juarez. It is part of literally the physical connection between our two countries, our 2 cities, and our 2 states. Hold on, just a second. I've got my dog in here and she's watching the kids play outside and is starting to bark. So, you know, the relationship is just very important to me. And when I was a member of Congress, one of the best decisions I made was to hire Mario Porras, who became our point person on U.S.-Mexico relations. So he would propose the policy that I would introduce as legislation in Congress to deal with immigration or the long wait times at the U.S.-Mexico point of connection at our bridges, or to address the mistreatment of Mexican nationals as they tried to cross into the United States, and to make sure that they were treated humanely like human beings, because so often they were not. Where my predecessor often described the border as a threat and held a U.S.-Mexico border security conference every year, when I was elected, and with Mario's help, we turned that around and made it a celebration of the relationship between the United States and Mexico. And we invited speakers from both sides of the border, hosted sessions on both sides of the border, and tried to tell our fellow Americans and our fellow Mexicans that the border is not a threat, it is our greatest opportunity. And one of the things that came out of that was a lot of fun was the U.S.-Mexico binational 10K foot race, which I had the honor of running with Governor Corral 2 years in a row. And I won't tell you which of us won that race, but it was a lot of fun, and it was an example of how we can celebrate this border. It brings me to this thought. How in the world, given all the beauty that exists between our 2 countries and where they meet at this point here in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, did we get to the place where we are now, where we have a president who made his case for the highest office in the land, the most powerful position on planet Earth, by talking about a wall 2,000 miles long, 30 feet high, between the United States and our greatest partner on the face of this planet, Mexico? How did we elect somebody who described Mexicans as rapists and criminals and killers, who caged young kids who traveled 2,000 miles on foot seeking refuge and asylum in a country comprised of asylum seekers and refugees? How we lost the lives of 6 children in our custody and care just over the last year alone? And how is it that we allow somebody to represent our interests in the White House who talks about immigrants as an invasion, asylum seekers as an infestation, and seeks to dehumanize them and describe them as a threat to this country? I ask all of that because I think it's really important when we try to answer the question surrounding the shooting that took place last year, August 3rd, in a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, where someone who had picked up the signal that our president had sent, all of the dehumanizing, demonizing, vilifying descriptions of Mexicans and immigrants and brown people and those who come from south of the border, who ordered an AK-47 online legally and then drove that weapon of war 600 miles from Allen, Texas to El Paso, walked into that Walmart in battle fatigues with headphones on to protect his ears, with shooting glasses and goggles on, and proceeded to kill 23 people based on their perceived immigration status or the color of their skin. We are all, in some ways, responsible, culpable, accountable for being able to answer the question for how that possibly could have taken place. When that shooter was arrested afterwards by the police here in El Paso, Texas, he said, "I came to kill Mexicans." In the days and weeks following that massacre, I went to countless funerals here in El Paso, Texas, and I also went to funerals in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And I went to the memorial just outside of the Walmart where people from Las Cruces and El Paso and Chihuahua and points further away all came together peacefully to try to understand what had happened, to make sense of it, and to resolve ourselves never to allow this to happen again. So here is our challenge that we share together. Though Donald Trump is in large part responsible for what is happening right now on the US-Mexico border, including the murder of those 23 people in this community, he did not arise out of a vacuum. He instead represents a tendency and a trend and a part of who we are in the United States of America. And unless we meet that threat and that challenge head on, unless we tell our own story for ourselves to the rest of the United States and to the rest of Mexico, we will continue to be defined by the hatreds and the racism and the violence that we have seen visited upon us in these recent years. One of the things that I'm going to do, and I'm hell-bent on this over the next 5 months, is to make sure that every single lever of our democracy here in Texas meets this challenge. I am trying to register hundreds of thousands of people to vote in Texas, and I'm trying to make sure they understand the stakes and the consequences of this next election. Because if we want to get the US-Mexico relationship right, if we want to facilitate more trade, more direct investment in our communities in El Paso and Juarez, if we want to have reduced wait times at our bridges, if we want to have a much better quality of life on the border, then we've got to get the leadership right here in the United States of America. That's one of the things that I'm going to do. But I'm also going to make sure that I am relentless in telling our story about who we are. We're not a scary place. We're not a dangerous place. We're not a threat to the United States of America. We are the most beautiful, the most amazing, the most breathtaking binational community on the face of the planet today. And we should be proud of that. And we should tell our story. And we should describe the value that we add to both of these countries so that we no longer bear the brunt disproportionately of these horrible policies or this hateful rhetoric or the violence that we have seen in recent years. So those are some thoughts on what's taking place right now, the way that I see this border, the challenges that are in front of us, and the ways in which I think we need to meet them. And I'm now looking forward to hearing what you have to say, answering your questions, or just hearing your comments or your ideas, or your suggestions. So again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Beto, for your presentation. As you know, we've had a lot of challenges over the last couple of years. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Please put your questions through the Q&A link on the bottom of your screen. And I think the first question will be made by Enrique Perret. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. The first question, Beto, comes from Marta Smith. She's one of our founders in the US-Mexico Foundation. And she said, Beto, you just described an amazing case of collaboration between Mexico and the US through the food bank that you mentioned. And the question is, do you have any ideas of how we might grow these initiatives or give more attention to them? It would be so helpful to counteract some of the mischaracterization of Mexico that exists in the United States. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we've got to tell these stories, right? And I need to do a better job of telling the rest of the country what Alvaro and others in Juarez and Chihuahua have been doing for El Paso. You know, if you were to ask the average American right now what their impression is of Mexico and what Mexico contributes to the United States, I'm afraid the answer we would hear, though it is not true, is widely held, that Mexico supplies illegal drugs and illegal immigration and cheap labor for what is manufactured between the United States and Mexico. Lost in that assessment is all of the contributions that we were talking about today, and the ingenuity and the innovation, and not just in manufacturing and economic terms, but in culture and the arts and families, in our history. That's profound, that's important, and we need to do a better job of sharing that. But I do see an opportunity. So I mentioned the electoral opportunity in the United States. We are on a very dark, dangerous path right now. And the ultimate conclusion of that, should Trump be reelected to another 4 years in office, I believe is to fully lose our standing as a democracy and a republic where we are governed by the rule of law, something that sets us apart from so much of the rest of the world. However, if we're able to defeat Donald Trump, if we're able to turn the page and begin a new chapter in this country, I really want us to focus on this relationship with Mexico, which I believe is the most important relationship that the United States has. And I fully intend to work with the next administration to make sure that this is a primary focus of theirs. But I think Mexico has some opportunities as well. As more of these jobs and investment opportunities reshore from China to North America, I think this is a wonderful chance for Juarez and Mexico at large, and El Paso and Texas, really the US-Mexico border, to invest in more than just the maquilas, more than just procurement of skilled but relatively low-wage labor, and invest in some of the long-term strategies like education and higher education and social and economic mobility that will allow us to be a draw for talent and innovation and investment. Once again, I mentioned, my great-grandparents and Amy's grandparents being born in El Paso and in Chihuahua. It's because their parents were drawn to this place. This was the center of activity and action, and they wanted to be where it was at. Let's be honest with each other. We are no longer the draw for talent. We are exporting young people away from our communities right now to Chicago and Mexico City and London and New York. We want them to choose to be here, but we're going to have to make those investments. And I think when we do that, we can change the story that the rest of our two countries believes about the US-Mexico border. But let's start with these immediate gains, like the collaboration on these food banks and some of the other things that we're doing in the midst of this pandemic.
Okay.
Thank you. I will go ahead and make the next question from Emilio Cadena. Where do you think Biden's rhetoric about Mexico will be?
I'm sorry, Emilio, is the question, what do I think Biden's focus on Mexico will be?
The rhetoric about Mexico will be.
Listen, I don't know. Vice President Biden is from Delaware, on the East Coast. He has spent most of his life in Washington, D.C. I think he was one of the youngest elected senators, in his 30s, and has served in the Senate for the better part of his life. And then obviously 8 years as Vice President of the United States, and now has been on the campaign trail for, the better part of a year and a half. He does not understand the border. And I love the guy, and I've endorsed him. I'm gonna vote for him. I'm gonna do everything in my power to make sure he wins. But I'm not going to count on him figuring out the relationship with Mexico. That's my job, and that's your job. And that's everyone who has a vested interest in improving the dynamic between these two countries. Let's not wait for anyone to ride into our rescue. Let's take matters into our own hands. And so I don't know if Biden is elected that I will have any formal role in that administration, but informally at least, I'm going to make sure that he is focused on this relationship. And again, this is a really important distinction. Critical that he sees Mexico not as a security threat from the perspective of drugs or immigration, but instead as a massive opportunity for the United States, even in our own selfish self-interest, economically, through immigration, through culture, through anything that you can measure, and all of the more important things that you cannot measure. This relationship is paramount. And over the last few decades, America has been tied down in wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, half a world away, when right next to us was the greatest opportunity to increase our GDP, our economic growth, job opportunities in the United States. And we have absolutely blown that opportunity by demonizing and vilifying Mexico and the US-Mexico border. So I'm going to make sure Biden changes that. So this was my way of kind of not answering your question. I don't know all the way what Biden thinks about Mexico, but to some degree it is unimportant to me because I'm going to make sure that we take the lead on this. We, the people of the US-Mexico border, we've taken so much shit for so long from Washington, D.C. by people who do not understand a thing about us. It's time for us to take that leadership. And it's part of the reason that I ran for Senate. It's part of the reason that I ran for the presidency. This could not be more important. So even though I'm not a candidate, even though I no longer hold an office, I'm still going to persist in this mission. So Emilio, thank you for the question.
Okay, Beto.
Great answer, Beto. Alvaro's next. Thank you.
Beto, I wanted to make a brief, I wanted to thank my group of OPM from Harvard. We have a small group of 250 people, which I've already introduced you to David Benitez and a couple of others. And they came and joined the call as well in the conference. So I wanted to just thank everybody that also joined. I wanted to put into perspective, Beto, we've seen a lot of attacks from Donald Trump Jr. and the president as well on their tweet against you. Can you go over as well on what happened the days when Trump came to El Paso and you holded a rally the same day, which was with the same amount of people? And what were the things that were happening at that moment? Can you brief us a little on what happened that day after the Walmart attacks?
Yeah. You know, I'll tell you, in some ways, even though I have been for my entire life focused and consumed by our identity here on the US-Mexico border and fighting for this border against some really strong forces in Mexico City, in Washington, D.C. There's something that significantly, profoundly changed in me after the shooting in August, after the murders, after the terror attack in this community. The racism that I had always known existed in this country, the hateful, vile rhetoric of this president, which had always been an element of his personality and his attraction for so many in this country. The violence that defines American life, that there are 100 people a day who lose their lives to guns every single day in the United States. No country on the planet comes anywhere close to this violence. And so disturbing is the fact that we allow people to walk around in states like ours here in Texas with weapons that were designed for war. So an AR-15 or an AK-47, which is the weapon the shooter used in El Paso, those were designed, engineered, manufactured, and sold to the militaries of the world for the express purpose of killing people as effectively, as efficiently, in as great a numbers as possible. No use for them for hunting, no use for self-defense. They are made to kill people. And we allow our citizens to parade around with these weapons and to threaten one another. It is a form of terror. You don't have to kill somebody to be a terrorist. It is enough to intimidate them with the threat of violence and to try to force your political aims on them to be a terrorist. And it's only after El Paso that I understood that we almost have a state-sponsored level of terrorism in this country right now. Terrorism that is born by Black Americans disproportionately. And I think everyone on this call has probably seen the video of the man who is killed by a police officer in Minneapolis earlier this week. The police officer with his knee on his windpipe, literally choking the life out of him as the victim says that he can't breathe. You may have seen the video that was filmed in February, but recently released, of a young Black man who is just jogging through a neighborhood in Georgia and is shot by a white person, young black man shot by a white person. And that person was free for months, not arrested. Another young woman shot by police who conducted a drug raid. But that's also been visited upon Mexican Americans in this country, disproportionate, unlike what is experienced by white people in this country. And all of that came to a head in El Paso, and changed forever how I see this and helped me to connect the dots. When Donald Trump talks about invasions and infestations and the animals who are coming to get us from south of the border, when at one of his rallies in Florida, he asked the big MAGA crowd, what are we going to do about these invading immigrants? And somebody in that crowd yells out, shoot them. And the president laughs and he smiles and he signals that that is okay. Then you have people who now in this country, based on the color of their skin or their perceived status of immigration, have a target on their backs. And we absolutely have to change it. So yes, we've got to change those who are in power and hold positions of public trust, but we also have to get guns off of our streets. We have to stop selling things like AR-15s and AK-47s. And I guess somewhat politically controversially, we have to buy back every single one of those that exists right now, because every one of them is a potential instrument of terror in this country. And then we have to reckon with our history, the 400-year legacy of slavery, the way that Mexican Americans and the Latino community are treated in the United States, the history of lynchings along the US-Mexico border, and the greatest massacre of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in US history going back 100 years that happened right in Walmart in El Paso just in August. And listen, if all of us just treat this as a bizarre act of one crazy person, or treat it as an act of nature or something that we can't control, then we are all complicit in what will happen next. This will continue to take place in this country. So Alvaro, I think a lot has changed for me personally. I hope a lot changes for this country. If we do not get it right, then we will lose the genius of America, which is we are a people from the planet over who by and large have been able to peacefully integrate and coexist in this country and democratically decide the direction and course that we will take. If we have political violence, if we have state-sponsored terrorism, if we fear for our lives because of who we are, the color of our skin, where we are born, then we will lose what was the last best hope, to quote Abraham Lincoln, of this earth. So I don't think there's a more important issue right now in this country.
Enrique.
Thank you, Alvaro. Let me take the question of Fausto Gurrea, and he's asking, what are the key issues that will be define the 2020 election in the U.S., Beto? And let me add to that, in your experience as a member of the Congress, what should be the relationship between the U.S. Congress and the Mexican Congress, this institutional architecture? I don't know if you were part of the interparliamentary group, but I think there is a lack of architecture there, Beto, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I'll take your last question first and your first question last. I was a part of the interparliamentary group with the United States and Mexico. And in the last year, Enrique, that I was in Congress, we also included Canada in that. So legislators from our three countries would meet in Washington, D.C., or Mexico City, or in Ottawa. And we would have, the kind of meetings you would imagine that we would have. We would all sit around, a conference table and take turns, introducing ourselves and describing what we thought the relationship meant, kind of formal, almost theatrical language, the ceremonial stuff that defines so much of government. But what was so valuable, at least in my opinion, is what would happen before or after those meetings when you're having breakfast together with a member of Congress from Chihuahua or from the Yucatan or from, British Columbia. And you're finding out what you have in common. You're building trust. You're getting to know one another. And these are relationships that extend beyond the meetings or the conferences or the get-togethers. And I found myself routinely staying in touch and reaching out to my peers in the Mexican Congress to ask what they thought about a given issue that was coming through, or I'd hear some news out of Mexico and I'd check in with them and I'd say, am I understanding this right? That kind of stuff is invaluable and very much threatened by the posture that the United States has taken right now. Again, defining Mexico as a threat, literally closing down the US-Mexico border. And from my perspective on the border, really seeking to humiliate Mexico in so many obvious ways and in so many ways that may not become apparent to us for many years. I remember when I was a member of Congress going to an elementary school here in El Paso, and I was meeting with a third grade class. And this was soon after Trump was elected. And this young girl said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And remember, she's in third grade, happens to be Mexican American, but she asked, "Why does the president not like me?" And it's because of everything she's heard this president say. And I wondered, what does that do to her head and her conception of who she is and what she's capable of doing in this country? Does she belong in the United States? And so we've really got to change that and get back to getting together. And when I was on the city council in El Paso, we got together with the city council in Ciudad Juarez. We'd travel to Juarez, they would travel to the US, and we would have meals together and beers together and get to know each other and be able to trust and rely and depend on one another. The other question you ask is, what are the issues that will determine the outcome of the 2020 election? I think one of them certainly will be this country and this administration's handling of coronavirus. We are, in the United States, 4% of the globe's population. We are now 1/3 of the globe's cases of coronavirus. We are 1/4, 25% of the globe's deaths from coronavirus. By any measure, we have screwed this up so bad. We have squandered our leading role in the world. We should be helping other countries right now. We should be helping Brazil and Mexico and India. Instead, we're having to seek help from other countries for the United States because we have so bungled the response, whether it is in testing or contact tracing or making sure that we isolate communities so that we don't further spread COVID-19. I'm deeply disappointed in that, and I don't think that I'm alone. And I think that you will even find disaffected Republicans and independents who for some reasons may like Trump, but for them, this will be the straw that breaks their back and forces them to consider voting for Joe Biden. But Trump, who is one of the savviest, smartest, the greatest genius when it comes to manipulating public opinion, understands this full well. And he will do everything within his power to distract us from focusing on the economy that is seeing the highest level of unemployment since the Great Depression of nearly 100 years ago, from the more than 100,000 deaths. And he's going to try to divide us and to distract us. And so far, he's doing a really good job. I don't know if you saw his tweets from either last night or today, but he's calling on the police in Minnesota after this man has just been killed, this black man killed by white police officers. He's calling on the police to open fire on protesters in those communities. And he wants us to be outraged and he wants us to be focused on that so that we're not focused on his mishandling of the response economically and from a public health perspective. But if Joe Biden and all of us who support him and are his advocates do a good job of reminding the American public what this is about, what's at stake, and what we could do going forward, reclaiming our global leadership role, then I think there's a really good chance that Biden can win. But I don't put anything past Trump, including making every effort to steal this election. So this is, I know every election is always described as the most important of our lifetimes. I cannot think of a more important election in the United States since the election of 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. This election will define the course that this country takes, and by extension, the course that much of the world takes.
Thank you, Beto. Next question is from Benito Fernandez. Beto, are you worried on the economic side of the position that Lopez Obrador is taking against private companies, both Mexican or U.S.? And do you think this will hinder the relationship between the countries, no matter who the president of the U.S. will be?
You know, I'm really concerned about the economies of both countries. You know, in a state like Texas, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which means that you can work a full-time job and be below the poverty line. You can work 2 full-time jobs and be below the poverty line. Many of those people, when I volunteer at the food bank in El Paso, Texas, are unemployed. They've recently been fired. But many of those people that I meet at the food banks are employed today. They're working at McDonald's, for example, or they're working at Walgreens. And after working really hard all day, you know, in some ways putting their lives on the line by going to work in the midst of this pandemic, they don't have enough money to put food on the table. I know that that is also true in many parts of Mexico. And I know that many people in Ciudad Juarez who work full-time struggle to be able to make ends meet and to feed themselves. So how do we, the United States and Mexico, invest in the human capital that will truly define the economic opportunities that we have? We've done really well for billionaires and millionaires. In fact, billionaires have increased their net worth in the midst of this pandemic at a time of record unemployment, record bankruptcy filings for small businesses, middle-class Americans, and folks who are already under the poverty line sinking even further. I mentioned some of those long-term investments that I think we need to make in social mobility, in economic mobility, in education, in infrastructure, in broadband technology, in wastewater and clean water systems, not just in Mexico. There are 48 water systems in the great state of Texas where it is not safe to drink the water today. Imagine investing in them, one, so that people can drink the water without getting sick, and two, because they create infrastructure jobs and direct investment in those communities. So I want to make sure that capitalism, which is the foundation of so much of our success here in the United States and so much of the success in Mexico, is brought to bear on some of these great challenges that we have, coming up with a vaccine, meeting much of the public health threats that we face. But I also want to make sure that capitalism is constrained in such a way that it helps those at the margins, the most vulnerable, the poorest, not only because morally and ethically it is the most just thing to do, but because when people are earning more, when they can provide for themselves, they're no longer dependent on the food bank or social services. They're able to consume more, buy more, contribute more to the economies of both of these countries. And I think we have, perhaps, this is maybe a silver lining, maybe this is naive, but coming out of the worst depression since the Great Depression of the 1920s and the 1930s, we have a chance to rebuild the economies of the United States and Mexico and prize the most important, positive, beneficial parts of them and fix those parts that are not working today. And so I hope that President Lopez Obrador, I hope that whoever the president is next for the United States, and I'm gonna do everything to make sure that it's Joe Biden, work with both business leaders and their employees and the unions who represent them to make sure that we make the most out of a really bad situation and ensure that should we meet a catastrophe, natural, man-made, or otherwise again, that we are more resilient in the face of it. That's the way that I would want to approach this economic challenge that we face.
Great. Thank you, Beto. These two questions go together. This one's from Mirna Rodriguez, and the other one's from David Benitez. Mirna's saying that, have you ever thought about setting up a GoFundMe or any kind of fundraiser to support the other side of the border? She says that this was done by a friend of hers in San Diego, and they raised over $100,000 for hospitals in Tijuana. And the other one is from David Benitez, which says the U.S. has already have a lot of Latinos which can help. bridge and nurture the U.S. and Mexico relationship, but we lack a sounded voice because they do not involve Mexico or other Latino countries. What can we do to change that? So that question kind of breaks up into two phases. Beto?
Yeah. So Irma and David, thank you for the questions. Irma, I think that's a great idea. And, we've raised money before for nonprofits and non-governmental organizations in Mexico, most recently for those who are trying to take care of asylum seekers from El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras who have overcrowded the shelters that exist, and many of whom are living on the streets. And we want to make sure that Americans understand they have an opportunity to help those who in some ways are on those streets right now because of American policy. And so in some ways, there's a way to make good. In El Paso and in Texas, we've raised more than $200,000 through folks who have contributed my campaigns in the past directly for these food banks. If you, Irma, after this call, and maybe Alvaro can follow up with me, if you can connect me with someone doing that kind of work in Juarez or in the state of Chihuahua, I would be very happy to connect the 1.6 million people who follow me on Twitter or the millions who follow us on Instagram and Facebook with these opportunities. There are a lot of good people who want to help, and I want to make sure I connect them with you and these opportunities. And then to David's question, when I was serving in Congress, I really made an effort to spend a lot of time, not just on the border in Matamoros or in Juarez or Nuevo Laredo, but in Tijuana, but also in Mexico City, but also in El Salvador, in Honduras, and in Guatemala, and Peru, and Chile. I traveled almost exclusively in Latin America and tried to bring other elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, with me so that we were no longer following the talking points or the party-approved messaging, but we were actually meeting the people whose policies were being affected by the legislation that we were voting on and proposing. And I found that to be eye-opening for me. And I also found it to be eye-opening for these legislators who come from North Carolina or Massachusetts or other parts of the country where they just don't live the experience that you and I take for granted here. And I found that, where before I'd be really pissed off by some of the things that they said about Mexico or Mexicans or the border, I realized that was born out of ignorance. They just didn't know us and never been here and didn't understand us. And when they saw us and listened to us and spent time with us, their rhetoric changed and their actions changed and the outcome improved. But that was one relationship at a time. So whether these elected leaders are Latino or Anglo or otherwise, I think it's really important that beyond taking an interest in U.S.-Mexico relationship or the U.S.-Latin America relationship, they actually spend time. And, official time, but as I mentioned earlier, time drinking coffee or drinking beer or sharing a meal or breaking bread. Because when you build real relationships in trust, you then begin to be able to change the underlying dynamic. And I think we need more of that.
Okay, one more question, Beto, and then we're gonna wrap it up. I'm gonna turn it out to Enrique, and this will be our last questions. I know we have a lot of questions. We're gonna follow up with you, and I'm gonna send them out to you, and then we'll follow up on that. Thank you.
That sounds good.
Thank you, Alvaro. Beto, this question is from Stony Burke, and it's about the business community. It says, prior to 2016 election, the U.S. business community was largely silent on Trump criticism on Mexico, a significant trading partner. For the NAFTA renegotiation, the U.S. business community was more vocal about this vital relationship. But during this pandemic, COVID-19, the U.S. business community has shifted to a more demanding tone about opening supply chains in Mexico when the health concerns don't justify it. How can the U.S. develop a better balance of mutual respect with Mexico and treat each other as an inseparable partner?
Yeah. Stoney, it's such a great question. You know, I talk about the president's dehumanizing rhetoric, invasion, infestation, animals to describe people. And there is a dehumanizing element of our capitalism in North America, and not always and not in all cases. And I want to make really clear to all the business leaders on this call, I too was an entrepreneur and started a business and had employees and understand some of the tough decisions and choices you have to make when you're trying to make payroll week in and week out and attract new clients and keep the clients you have happy. But if we only see people as inputs in the finished product and the bottom line and the profits we make, then we will have the kind of outcomes that we have seen in factories in the United States, where you have an epidemic in COVID cases and COVID deaths in meat packing plants in Texas, in Iowa, in North Dakota, throughout this country. And you also have seen that in factories in Ciudad Juarez and other parts of Mexico. If all we care about is the ends, that package of low price meat that I can pick up in Albertsons, or that finished automobile that was manufactured in Michigan and in Juarez or in Chihuahua, then we'll be okay with any means to get there. But if instead we start with those who make this possible, the human capital, those laborers, those human beings, our neighbors, our vecinos, with whom we live and share this borderland, then I think we have a more just capitalism and an economy that truly works for everyone. You all may be familiar, there's this wonderful speech that Robert Francis Kennedy gave about the gross domestic product, GDP. And I can't remember what year he gave it, in 1967, 1968. He says, look, GDP might measure the economic output of this country, but it in no way measures human happiness or our health or well-being or our families or the impact that a piece of art or a poem has in our lives. And I found that to be so fucking profound and amazing and beautiful and true. And I don't want to lose sight of it at this moment. If you're like me, you're spending more time with your family right now because you're trying to do the right thing by not traveling and not congregating. And despite this pandemic and the deaths and the suffering that are taking place, there's something really beautiful in that. And I hope that beyond our relationships with our families and how we decide to conduct ourselves and live our lives going forward, that we think about the other people that we impact with the decisions that we make. And so, Stoney, you asked a question. There's a lot of pressure from these US manufacturers on the maquilas and the maquila workers to reopen and to go back to work, even though we are not clear yet that it is safe enough to do so. And those American companies have the leverage, right? My dad had a maquila on Calle Peru in Juarez. And I remembered, and it was tough for him. And all of his customers were in the United States, and they could pay him when they wanted to pay him. And if they didn't pay him on time, they'd say, come sue me. And he really had to jump when they said jump. And in some ways it was kind of humiliating. I really hope that in our country, which disproportionately holds the leverage and the keys to so much of this relationship, that we understand that what we produce, what we make, how we grow this economy would not be possible without the people of Ciudad Juarez or the state of Chihuahua or Mexico. And we had better start treating them as our fellow human beings and treating them like people. And when we do that, I think they are going to do better, and I think we are going to do better. I think our economies are going to improve on both sides of the border, and I think we will live in a more moral, ethical, and just country. That's my hope, and that's what I'm going to work for. And we have a great test of that right now in how we reopen our economies and how we treat those who will be on the front lines of these reopenings. So thank you for the question.
Okay. Just in a couple of words, Beto, just before we wrap up, I've seen a tendency of the questions about your thoughts about AMLO's attack on the private initiative, which we've seen several questions. Can you focus just in a very quick, brief, what are your thoughts about AMLO's rhetoric against the private initiative?
I'll say this. This is from my perspective and perhaps from an American perspective. There is a trend or a tendency in this country towards socialism, towards a complete government control of major parts of our economy. And I understand where that's coming from. And I don't think it's a malicious idea. I don't think it's evil in intent. And I think it's coming from a badly broken capitalism that has really hurt working families in this country. I mean, people working full-time who can't pay for the food on the table and are going to food banks is evidence enough for me that something is badly broken and needs to be fixed. But the answer is not government takeover. It's not government control, and it is not socialism. Capitalism, innovation, ingenuity, and yes, even the profit incentive and motive are profoundly powerful in what they can bring to bear in addressing the challenges that we have. If we left it solely up to the government to come up with a cure or a vaccine to COVID, I don't know how soon we would get there. But when we set the private market loose within constraints and guardrails and a safe level of oversight and regulation, then we are able to much more quickly than we otherwise would be able to get to the cures, get to the answers, get to the solutions that we seek. We can look at technology, Zoom that we're using right now. If we waited for the United States government to come up with a video conferencing platform that would allow all of us to talk with one another, we'd still be waiting right now and talking through tin cups connected by string to one another. It was private innovation, and it was the markets, and it was capitalism that allowed that to happen. So I don't know all the details of what President López Obrador is proposing or doing in Mexico right now. But my fear is that if you do not allow private initiative, if you do not allow capitalism, if you do not allow markets to work, then you will set back the progress that we are capable of making. It's just that those markets and that capitalism and those business interests need to also be harnessed to the public good and the common welfare. If they're not, and if you have a disconnection, then you have some of the deep divisions that you see forming here in the United States, where the gulf between the poorest and the wealthiest has never been greater. And the discontent that you see manifest in our elections, in the rioting, in the protesting that's taking place right now will only become worse. So I don't know that it's an either or proposition. It's just being much smarter about the way that we do things in both countries.
Okay, let's wrap it up. Beto needs to jump into another conference. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank everybody for joining into this call. Gracias a todos mis amigos. Le agradecemos aquí a Beto la intervención de sus preguntas y les damos una muy cordial agradecimiento a Beto por habernos presentado el día de hoy. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and to everyone on, and for the really great questions. And as soon as it is safe to do so, I look forward to being able to see everyone in person here in El Paso or in Juarez or wherever we have a chance to meet. Be safe, be well, and I look forward to seeing you down the road. Bye-bye. Adios.
Adios, Beto.
Thank you, Beto. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Nos quedamos sin